and welcome to the Global Agriculture Innovation Forum. I'm Gerald Shively, Associate Dean and Director of International Programs in the College of Agriculture at Purdue University, your host for this year-long series of events. On behalf of the organizing committee, our advisory group, and everyone contributing to this effort, I'd like to welcome you. I'd also like to thank USDA, especially the Foreign Agricultural Service, for its ongoing support of forum events. Our goal for this year-long series of events is to explore the frontier of agricultural innovation with a view to feeding the world sustainably. With today's event, we launched the third theme of the forum on post-harvest innovations. Previous sessions in the series have included presentations and moderated discussions with numerous scientists and global thought leaders. Those presentations are recorded and available on the forum website, along with links to a range of curated resources related to session topics. Without further delay, I'd like to get started with today's outstanding set of thought-provoking presentations on food safety and food quality, highlighting innovations that extend from the farmer's field to the consumer's fork. I'll now turn things over to our moderator, Dr. Hayley Oliver, who joins us from Purdue University, where she is a professor of food science and director of the USAID Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Safety. Please enjoy the program, and please stay for the live question and answer period that will follow the presentations.
Thank you, Dean Shively, and it is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this session, where we really dive into food safety and quality. My name is Hayley Oliver, and I'm a professor of food science at Purdue University in the Department of Food Science. And I also have the pleasure of serving as the director of the USAID Feed the Future Food Safety Innovation Lab. The Food Safety Innovation Lab's focus of food safety, our role is to fund and support research that truly drives food safety improvements around the world. We currently have programming in Senegal, Kenya, Bangladesh, and Cambodia. So we have frontline researchers that are trying to solve some of the biggest challenges around food safety. And some of those researchers are here with me today. It's my pleasure to bring together this panel of early and mid-career faculty that are at the leading edge of finding solutions for particularly small stakeholder farmers to overcome some of those barriers of food safety, not only at the local level and traditional markets, but helping them find ways to see those products to larger markets where regulations can be somewhat challenging. Why does food safety matter? We know that there are over 600 million cases of foodborne disease around the world globally each year, which can result in several 100,000 deaths. And what we know about food safety is the vast majority of those challenges can be prevented. And so what you'll hear today is from a number of researchers, again, at the front line, trying to solve these challenges, how we can be particularly in preventive space of keeping our foodborne hazards out of food so that our families and our neighbors and then consumers around the world can be ensured that they're consuming safe food. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Faith Kreitzer is an associate professor and produce safety extension specialist at Washington State University in the School of Food Science. Her extension program is focused on providing science-based recommendations and trainings to farms and packing houses so that they can develop robust food safety programs. And this means that she spends almost 6,000 hours working with farmers directly, farmers and producers. Her research program aligns with that of her outreach and engagement extension program as she seeks to fill knowledge gaps tied to bacterial foodborne pathogens in the pre-harvest and post-harvest environment. Faith, over to you.
Hello, and thanks for joining me for this talk titled Innovations in Water Treatment for Produce Safety. We are all too familiar with examples of past produce outbreaks, which have ultimately been linked to contamination which occurred either in the growing, harvesting, or packing environment. This is driven by many factors, but it's primarily centered around the fact that produce is consumed raw in many instances, and we do not have interventions which we can really apply, such as cooking, to inactivate foodborne pathogens if they happen to be deposited. We also know that foodborne pathogens do not come with GPSs, so this is something that we're encountering across the globe, and therefore we really need to think holistically about what treatments can be applied or control mechanisms can be applied for preventing foodborne pathogen contamination. When we think about the farm to fork supply chain for produce, it spends a fair amount of time in the field, followed by harvesting, further processing or packing, distribution, and ultimately finds its way into the consumer's kitchen. We're going to think about today water as a mechanism of or a mode of contamination for produce, and what methods can we apply to try and prevent that contamination. We're going to look at two scenarios, looking at both the pre-harvest as well as the post-harvest environment. This is really important considering that some produce never enters the packing house, and therefore really trying to evaluate critically, water and its quality and how we can improve that quality, because you can't change your water source many times. And also looking at that post-harvest environment and trying to figure out how we can prevent cross-contamination. Water treatment has been applied for more than a century, and many times when we're looking at its application in other scenarios, we're going to draw from that knowledge. However, we do have completely different scenarios than we do in, say, a potable water treatment system. In our pre-harvest environment, we have very fast flow rates and a wide range of water quality that we can see from day to day. In post-harvest water treatment, we have an extremely large volume of water. Many times we're trying to manage, and essentially given constraints around water availability, we're trying to get the most life out of that water while we're using it. When we're thinking through how do you go about choosing water treatment, really looking at things such as regulatory approval, cost and infrastructure constraints, such as, do you have electricity availability? Can you get some of these chemistries such as chlorine in your location? Other things that are far more practical, such as what is our water source? What is the general quality? With surface water giving us the most challenges there, but ultimately a large amount of what we use for production. And then also thinking through water volume application method. If the crops have any sensitivity to any of these treatments, we don't want to, impact our quality. And then thinking through who are we selling to, either through our exports or domestic sales. Organic sales drive a lot of decisions in the United States. And also thinking about worker protection standards, since again, none of these treatments come without risk. And then other national or local environmental considerations, since all this water is going to be returned back into that environment. When we think about pre-harvest context of water treatment, it is really hard to have science-based conversations with growers. And we conducted a study to evaluate 3 commonly considered pre-harvest water treatments to see how effective they were in comparison to each other. We looked at UV light, chlorine, as well as peroxyacetic acid. We looked at these alone as well as in combination with one another. Ultimately, what we were able to find is that each of these chemistries or devices, such as the case with UV light, was capable of effectively controlling generic E. coli populations, which is one of our best indicators of water quality for pre-harvest water. However, when we looked at our overall E. coli populations in this water source, they were fairly low. So we extended it to a bit broader group of coliforms, which again are another index organism set for which generic E. coli is a member of. What we see here is that we were able to effectively reduce our populations by at least 2 to 3 log in these cases, which is a 99 to 99.9% reduction. What we also see here is that as the system ran, so all the water was receiving the same treatment, all systems were very stable across time, and all systems performed similarly in looking at these scenarios, giving us a lot of fuel for being able to recommend certain treatments as far as being equivalent to one another when we look at our end goals as far as reducing these index organism populations. So our takeaways were there are many options that are capable of achieving our food safety goals, and we need to look at flexibility of these systems to accommodate production options such as availability of electricity, chemistry availability, and water volumes ultimately we're trying to treat. In changing the context and looking at post-harvest water, again, thinking about that, most of the decisions are made around how resistant is a treatment to organic matter? Does that treatment have a strong oxidation capacity, which is our primary mode of inactivation for these foodborne pathogens? And also looking towards no cytotoxic damage to the crop we're actually packing out. So that's a very fine line to walk, where you're inactivating the cells through this mechanism, but not killing the fruit or vegetable quality. Again, we're looking at some of the same chemistries here, as well as incorporating ozone, which does have a little bit better application in the post-harvest world. When we think about post-harvest water, many times there are different challenges encountered. So sometimes we're using single pass systems, which the water is pumped in and then only comes in contact with crop once. This is a far more simpler system to manage the risk of cross-contamination in, as compared to our multi-pass or recirculated water systems, which water is used sometimes up to 3 to 5 days, depending upon water availability. But the parameters need to be the same in both systems, that ultimately that water doesn't drive cross-contamination risk to the crop that is being packed out. Most people don't realize that washing is actually a pretty ineffective inactivation step for removing foodborne pathogens if they happen to be present. We have a simple example here where we inoculated snacking peppers with salmonella and then washed them either in water alone or water with chlorine or chlorinated water that had a fairly high significant organic load, which would be indicative of water towards the end of its use life in that multi-day scenario. What we see here is that regardless of the type of chemistry or even just plain water, essentially what we're doing is physically removing these microorganisms from the surface. However, where we are able to make an impact is preventing cross-contamination once those microorganisms make their way into the water from then interacting with another piece of produce and contaminating it. And looking at this, when we took uninoculated peppers and followed behind after the inoculated peppers, in our chlorine scenario, we had very little cross-contamination. In reality, we would never expect to have salmonella populations quite this high going in. So we would expect that ultimately this chlorine without an organic load should be fairly effective at mitigating that risk of cross-contamination. However, you can see drivers such as organic load significantly impact efficacy over time. So it's really important that we then study the end users and how are they using the water and how does that organic loading change? Here's one example from an apple packing flume where we see over the use life of 85 hours, we have a range in COD, which is our best predictor of organic loading that ranges from 2,500 all the way down to 0 at startup. So when we think about the largest factors impacting post-harvest water chemistry, we really need to look towards the water volume, the knowledge that more packing houses are really looking to get more life out of their reused water, and looking towards joining this with really good filtration systems so that they can better remove some of that organic load impacting efficacy. In our single pass systems, where we have lower flow rates, we can also look towards incorporation of novel chemistries such as ozonation, which is generated on site, as well as chlorine dioxide. And looking forward, we have a lot of movement in water treatment on both pre-harvest and post-harvest fronts. It's really important for us to understand what drivers are present for our end users when we're considering what treatments may be best for them to adopt. Ultimately, with pre-harvest, we want to have a treatment that's adaptable to short contact time at very low concentration, since we're returning that back to the environment. And for post-harvest, we really want our treatments to be resilient through high organic loading conditions without a significant increase in cost compared to some of our more commonly used compounds such as chlorine and PAA. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Faith. I think you did an amazing job in a very brief amount of time highlighting some of the challenges when it comes to water safety, both in pre-harvest and post-harvest, and some of the technologies that are really kind of coming up, how we can improve the quality and also certainly the safety of water. Important for all of us, certainly. An easy one to make a case for. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Matt Stashevitz is an assistant professor of applied food science in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His work focuses on applying engineering and data analytic approaches to advance food safety microbiology. One longstanding research thrust that he has is the identification and management of persistent Listeria monocytogenes, an organism dear to my heart, in food environments using modern DNA sequencing and improved data analysis techniques. His lab also works on international teams to develop appropriate technologies to manage mycotoxins in maize, which his contribution being single kernel identification and sorting using relatively simple hardware. His lab also has been developing a set of projects to improve sampling and testing for foodborne pathogens in large-scale food production environments. And we're going to hear about that from him today. Over to you, Matt.
Hello, I am Dr. Matt Stashevitz at the University of Illinois, and I am excited to give you a quick talk on my research program and the broader field of food safety microbiology, specifically around the question of can we test produce for safety. And largely this brief intro slide is here just to give you a view of my lab. It's a large team effort, a lot of people working on this problem, and I wanted to give a chance to quickly acknowledge them all and their support people in the work that they've done to help our program proceed. But if you want more information about what we do, or to contact me or to collaborate, please feel free to do that. So as I continue, I want to start with this hook of just why food safety testing? Why is this important? And I suspect that many of you in this audience are either a grower, a producer, a buyer, a seller, and at some point in that system, you've likely come across a certificate of analysis in your work that has a line in there somewhere that says this product has been tested for a particular foodborne pathogen like Salmonella or pathogenic E. coli or Listeria, and it's tested negative. Likely, if it's a good COA, it's tested negative in less than 25 grams, or if the lab had splurged and spent more money, maybe it was 375 grams, ensuring that that product is safe. Well, it shows actually that in the 25-gram sample of food that was sent to the lab, they did not detect the specific foodborne pathogen that was assayed on the sheet. So you know that, for example, that 25 grams of maybe lettuce sample that was sent to the lab didn't contain pathogenic E. coli or didn't contain Salmonella. In a sense, that's all. And what you're trusting is that the processor, the grower, the whoever was upstream in the chain collected that sample in a representative enough way that hopefully that small portion of product was enough to make a claim about the larger lot that was being tested. And additionally, if you're a consumer, you might not have seen a COA, you might not know what they are, but you probably assume that something like this is happening in the industry, that people are testing your food, they're ensuring that it's safe, and that gives you more assurances that what you eat is acceptable, right? That's the standard paradigm. And it makes sense. The challenge is if that really achieves. I think that one of the things that happens, though, is we still see issues. We still see foodborne disease. We still see recalls. We still see outbreaks. Maybe as a bit of a hook to that, I'll show you that there was a question, why do outbreaks like this occur in the US? This was, I think, in 2019 around Thanksgiving time, right? Another recall of romaine lettuce ahead of Thanksgiving linked to Salinas, right? So challenging, large production, major growing area, major recall instead of a major before a major holiday in a major and well controlled supply chain. I bring this up just to say that while I know this is likely a global audience, right, there are still challenges everywhere in the world. And these are happening because of these new issues in the food supply chain. We're trying to get a consistent worldwide supply of fresh produce of all types, at all locations, at all times. And that's increasing the scale of production. And as you increase the scale of production, even if those individual production units are just as safe or even safer than smaller scale production, that increased scale means that when there are failures, they have the potential to be larger. And in this modern food safety system, I just showed you an example of a larger failure in the US before a holiday, right? Which is definitely a challenge. And why this is particularly a challenge in the fresh produce industry is it has some particular issues that make it harder to use our standard food safety controls. There's no kill step in processing because these foods are delicate. They're not cooked. People generally want to eat their produce raw. And it's harder to control production because this is distributed outdoor in the landscape, open systems. Right, so this all means that we have to use other tools to both control and then verify the control of foodborne pathogens in those systems. And really what we're left with then is really good world-class, good agricultural practices, good manufacturing practices, well-controlled supply chains, and then in some sense, testing to verify that system works. And this is where I want to point out that one of the major challenges in this system is simply that testing is hard. And I can show you a quick picture of why. This is a picture of leafy green production in Salinas, showing essentially the industry standard practice right now of sending a person, a trained food safety professional out in the field to collect a grab sample of produce pre-harvest, where they're grabbing usually about 60 samples of leaves from this large field, placing it in a bag and sending that bag to a lab to provide that COA that I initially described, right? That would then test it for pathogenic E. coli or salmonella or listeria, whatever the hazard of concern is. And so what I want to point out here is that this is hard, right? The scope is huge. What is actually the likelihood that this trained professional is going to be able to grab the few leaves in the field that do contain that pathogen and give you that appropriate claim? In addition, operationally, it becomes challenging because then you have to spend the money on that test. It requires time, and in the fresh produce industry, time is money as these products are perishable. And to do that lab work, it either costs maybe tens of US dollars per test or a specialized lab with trained professionals and equipment to do all this work. So it's really quite a burden, and quite a burden in a very challenging situation to take a representative sample, which really starts to beg the question, what is the value of some of these produce testing systems? And one of the things that our group and other people in the food industry, particularly the fresh produce industry, are working on are other lines of work to really start to answer these questions about how to use this testing better in the modern food supply chain, because when industry is doing this well, they're controlling their system, they're getting thousands and thousands of tests per lot, and the vast majority are coming back negative, but you still see recalls and outbreaks. Clearly, we need to continue to improve. And I hope that by talking about some of this work and seeing what's even being done here in our context, this can be applicable to other supply chains in other countries as well. And so what I'm just going to quickly give two examples of are the two types of work that I think our lab can provide the most specific input on. Very quickly, I'll try to. The first thing I want to talk about is some of the work that we're doing for better field testing, where what we're trying to do is actually simulate produce in fields by creating fields, putting hazards, doing sampling with different patterns, different lab assays, and iterating that to make decisions. And what that will allow us to do is test these different sampling plans and match them to hazards to see what we can and can't detect in fields. And without subjecting you to the gory details, a lot of what we found in this work is that you can't do just that industry standard of N60 sampling to get up to 300 grams of product and expect to detect all the hazards in a field. What that can really work for is it can detect gross contamination events. If you've had failed irrigation and water treatments, if you've spread contaminated manure over your field, the sampling is likely to detect that. But it's not that likely to detect small scale issues like small animal intrusion events or fecal pellets, or really low levels of contamination that might create some residual risk in your system, but not be a catastrophic failure. So if you're thinking about sampling your fields, think about that as a method to detect major failures, not a method to drive your risk in field produce to zero. And some of the things we're working on next in that line of work is, could we do better sampling through aggregation? Could we swab tissue instead of sending grabs to the lab and get better results that way? Another piece of work that we're trying to pursue is optimizing testing across the supply chain. That if we think about the whole production chain from primary production to harvest to processing to packing to consumption, what is the best testing at each of these stages? Can we apply that where it's most sensitive and most economically efficient so that we reject the lots where it's most appropriate and retain the lots that are safe throughout the chain? And I bring that up because if you're in that supply chain, what you've often seen with those COAs is something that I hear described as cover your blank testing, right? I'll call it cover your liability testing, right? That the buyer wants to know the supplier has tested their product and it's safe. And we've talked about some of those limitations. So the real question is, if we could look at the supply chain as a whole, what's the appropriate stage to detect the hazard? Is it really intensive testing pre-harvest? Where if we can leave the contaminated product in the field, then we know it won't percolate throughout the chain. Well, that costs a little bit more money up front, but is potentially safer because there's not a risk of cross-contamination. But how do you get the trust throughout the chain that all the other control measures are correct? And how do you then get a grocer to trust the packer that they've bought from a supplier that has had a good pre-harvest control measure? Right? That's a challenge. It's a challenge both to know where you should test to get sensitive detection and good rejection, and then also the right data science tools to ensure that that communication works. And I think as blockchain, as the Internet of Things, as control strategies on tablets continue to improve, we might be able to pursue this work even further. So I hope in this brief talk, I've showed you a few things that spur your thinking, and which I will summarize here. Hopefully that food safety testing, if you're asked to do it, is assessing a small portion of a whole lot of food. It cannot drive risk to zero. That testing, particularly pre-harvest, but all testing, is mainly useful for identifying major failures and verifying that the other things you do for control are working. And I think there are some really good opportunities for optimized testing across the supply chain, particularly as we improve our communication tools to build trust in that system. With that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session.
Thanks, Matt. And I would encourage everyone, please send us your questions. We do have a panel discussion after the four speakers have completed their presentations. And please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of the screen to submit those questions. Matt, I think you did an excellent job highlighting that there's really a need for resource focusing. We can't, as growers and small stakeholder farmers, can't spend vast amounts of money trying to test all of their food in order to make sure it's safe to send it on to either traditional markets or larger markets beyond that. And finding the best way to sample to get the most out of our sampling plans is really an important field of study. I know I'm asked routinely how to design a sampling plan, and it's really needs to be data driven and not so much in art form. So thanks again for your comments there. It's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Dharmendra Mishra. Dr. Mishra joined Purdue University after 7 years or so in the professional experience in global food companies as a process engineer and process authority. Dr. Mishra has an extension and research appointment in the Department of Food Science, where he works with food manufacturers, small businesses, entrepreneurs, and regulators to manufacture shelf-stable foods products that, of course, are free of pathogens and have a long shelf life because of low spoilage risk. Dr. Mishra also serves as a process authority, bridging gaps between manufacturers of shelf-stable products and regulatory agencies, and of course conducts research here at Purdue, where he trains a number of students. Over to you, Dharmendra.
Hello everyone. Today we are here to talk about the commercial manufacturing of shelf-stable food products. I am Dharmendra Mishra, Assistant Professor at Department of Food Science, Purdue University. So what do we mean by shelf-stable food products? It means that it does not require refrigeration. Okay, what a great benefit, right? In the parts of the world where we do not have the refrigerated supply chain, where we could not afford that, maybe because we don't have all of the infrastructure to support a refrigerated supply chain or the retails, and aseptically packaged product which could be shelf stable, meaning we can be at ambient temperatures or room temperature conditions for its distribution and storage. So we are talking about the products that are stable at room temperature conditions for a year or more. So what is the need? So the first aspect that we are going to talk about is the need for such a technology of food processing. Well, you can think of scenarios where we may have excessive production of the fresh produce. Let's say it could be fruits or vegetables or any other kind of crops where we may need to process and save it for off-season use or future use. So we could avoid the kind of food loss that happens at the farm level, right? And I have seen examples of tomatoes going to a huge amount of waste because it could not be sold at a fair price and there were no buyers in that region to get all of these tomatoes. So a good aspect is that we can process them and we can keep it for the future use or develop value added products. This could also be helpful for the times that we are in, right? So we are in pandemic situation right now, and when we think about all of the, specifically the fresh produce that could be spoiled after the harvest, if we can process them safely, that could be a great value added product that we can make, right? So that could be a different stream of revenue for the farmers or people who are engaged in farming such food products. Now, when we can have a shelf-stable food product, we remove the refrigeration completely from our distribution chain. And this could be especially helpful in the regions where we do not have a refrigerated supply chain readily available. So this kind of technology could provide a great benefit in those areas. Now, when we think of technology for manufacturing these shelf-stable food products, there is retorting for canned food products. That's our traditional thermal processing. And then we have aseptic processing, where we could process it much effectively by keeping great quality of the food products. And by the way, we do not need to use preservatives in these shelf-stable food products. They are clean label food. The only way we eliminate the pathogenic microorganisms or spoilage causing microorganisms by the use of heat and heat only. So we have very specific process parameters that we use to design such processes. So when we think about the design, when we think about the technology, the validation of technology becomes critical. We want to make sure that when we are using such technologies, it is safe. We do not have any concerns of spoilage of the food product or any public health concern as well. So aseptic processing, there is a great history behind it. It could be used for many different type of products and many different type of packages, because it provides a great deal of flexibility in packaging material. So you can see an example here. This is an HDPE bottle that can be used for many different kind of products. Here is a PET bottle, a clear PET bottle that could be used for, let's say, chocolate milk based product or other kind of food products that are ready to drink. It could be a coffee, or it could be mocha or something else, right? Another example here is sweet potato puree. This kind of products can be used for segments where we have lots of production of certain crops. So we can save the products by aseptically packaging it. From small packages, we can also go to the institutional size large packages, such as this one right here. We could fill a liter bag or maybe up to 10 or 50 liters. The size is not dependent on because we are not using canning processes. So a large package is not a limitation for aseptic. We can fill any kind of large packages. We could also have small pouches like this one right here, the spouted pouch, where we can aseptically fill it. You may have seen lots of pouches, but those are either retorted or hot fill processed products. This is one of the first ones that are launched, where we could fill them aseptically. So you can see there is variety of packaging options when we talk about the aseptic processing and packaging. Now the technology is there, right? So we have the aseptic processing units, we have aseptic fillers, aseptic tanks, but these are large manufacturing facilities. When we think about the regions of the world where we may not have all of the power supply to support continuous production, such as aseptic processing, we can think of the innovations in the area where we may have uninterrupted power supplies by providing some other means of energy source. We could also have innovations in making these operations smaller, in a smaller footprint, or it could be mobile. So those kind of innovations will come in near future, where we have a small footprint systems, a small scale production, not a large scale, where a cooperative of farmers perhaps could use such a system to produce the ultimate food product or any kind of formulation that they can come up with to add value to their specific product. And there could be other opportunities, such as medical foods as well, or personalized nutrition. We are getting into an era of personalized nutrition, where we may be able to tweak the formulas for a specific segment of population or for individualized needs. And this technology provides a great benefit in producing such product that are stable at room temperatures. And there are other advantages in terms of saving our produce in the regions where we have large productions. So we will talk more about it when we have the questions in discussion section. But just to wrap up this preliminary overview of the technology for commercial manufacturing of shelf-stable food products, we need to have the technology that exists today. What are the new innovations can we have so that it can be applied more broadly? So we'll be looking into those innovative aspects of processing and packaging as well that goes together with the food laws and regulations, because we need to have validated systems in order to avoid any kind of food safety risks and also the spoilage risks of the food product.
Thanks, Dharmendra. I think you made an excellent case for the interface between food safety, food quality, how it relates to food security, and really how a technology like aseptic processing really gets at the heart of preventing or reducing loss and doing it while maintaining quality and keeping food safe. And it's a really important technology. And as you kind of alluded to, it's a technology that has a very deep Purdue history, a technology that was developed here several years ago, but has found its way around the world. And you can see that you saw some of the packaging that may be familiar to you. Even something like bottled water can go through one of these processes. So really has made a large impact. And the question becomes, as you said, how do we scale it to a more regional scale? Because often this is large scale production. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Jessie Vipum is an assistant professor at Kansas State University in food safety and a member of the Food Safety Innovation Lab, where she's conducting research in Cambodia. Her research focuses on improving the global understanding of food safety and foodborne disease and their impact on public health, particularly for vulnerable populations. Jessie's research seeks to provide adoptable and applicable solutions for reducing foodborne pathogen contamination in a number of food value chains around the world. Jessie's been involved in food safety and food security research in Central America, South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. So over to you, Jessie.
Good morning. My name is Jessie Vipum, and I'm an assistant professor at Kansas State University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about innovative spaces in familiar places, which is just a really fun way for me to say that I'm going to be talking to you about our work in traditional fresh food markets in Cambodia. I always find that it's important whenever talking about food safety in middle and low income economies, which Cambodia would be one of those, to discuss the duality of food insecurity and food safety. And so when we look at statistics from around the world, we see that 1 in 5 people are food insecure and 1 in 8 suffer from foodborne illness. And on its own, those statistics are pretty astounding. But we don't typically stop to consider the fact that when we consider that one person, it's typically the same person. And so in many situations where we have low-income environments, people who experience food insecurity often also experience a higher likelihood of coming into contact with unsafe food. And so a lot of our work in Cambodia has focused on this nexus of food insecurity and food safety. From a food safety perspective, across the world, whether you're in a low-income environment or a high-income environment, we really have 3 basic questions that we're seeking to answer. And that is, what causes foodborne illness? How do we mitigate it? And what will people ultimately do in terms of mitigating foodborne illness? So what will people adopt? And in many low-income environments, what we find is that there's not a lot of data that will communicate to us or direct us in terms of what is causing foodborne illness. And when you don't have data to direct your decision-making, it ultimately becomes very challenging to then answer these next 2 questions. And what we are really seeking to do in Cambodia in these fresh food markets is to answer all 3 of these questions. But we are starting with this first question of how do we create data that helps to direct our decision-making? So why do we select fresh food markets? Well, in my opinion, fresh food markets really provide an opportunity for innovation in, like I said, a traditional space, a place that's very familiar to people. And so ultimately, Cambodians use fresh food markets as their major source of food procurement. You find that across income levels within the country, most Cambodians shop within these fresh food markets. And when we think about the role of fresh food markets in terms of providing nutrition for human beings, they really are a wonderful space. So if I look at this picture to the left, that from a nutrition perspective, this is pretty exciting. I have some lean proteins, I have some leafy greens. And so from a local production perspective and marketing perspective, I am being able to bring nutritious foods to people. However, if I put my food safety hat on, I can easily see that there's some major issues here. And so when we think about these fresh food markets, typically they have a real opportunity in terms of alleviating food insecurity and nutrition issues. However, they commonly lack a lot of basic food safety principles, such as sanitary design, food safety handling practices, sanitation. And so really digging in this space may provide a lot of opportunity to help Cambodia meet some of the nutrition goals that it has. And some of the data that we have collected within these fresh food markets really does demonstrate that there's a pretty high level of contamination occurring. And this contamination occurs not only on vegetables that are being sold within the markets, but also on surfaces that we find within markets. And that's on food contact and non-food contact surfaces. And so this data really does direct that we have some work to do within these markets. So what is the innovation, you may be asking yourself? When it comes to these markets, as I've said already, they are a real traditional setting. And so there's no need to try to create any type of demand from a Cambodian perspective for these markets. And so if we can work with these markets to create better environments for food safety, there really is an opportunity for innovation, even though it may look fairly basic from some of the innovation standards that we have. And so some of these innovations are as simple as establishing sanitary design. And so if you look at these pictures to the right, some basic things such as reorganizing the markets so that we separate lean proteins, meat from fresh vegetables, trying to control pests, moving vegetables up off of the ground. Those are all innovations for these markets that could have some real impacts. Ultimately, we would like to determine critical control points, which is verbiage that we've stolen a bit from HACCP, which is a codex or a U.S. food safety program, which is just simply to state we want to be able to identify the points where we see the largest amount of contamination and then be able to implement some adoptable interventions that really can help to reduce the amount of contamination that we see and help to increase the amount of safe food being sold within these environments. We would ultimately like to see a lot of investment in monitoring programs from a government perspective, training and education, and then ultimately see the development of functional food safety networks. And this is really to create relationships between government officials, market vendors, and consumers, because relationships are really where we see things become sustainable and commitments ultimately be met. And so to finalize, we really do see these fresh food markets as traditional settings that all Cambodians typically access. And so that really holds a lot of potential for us to find new innovations or even reimagine some of our current innovations and set them into motion within these markets. We think that these markets should be considered a primary focus for research, investment, and development, and that ultimately these markets hold a real opportunity for the duality of combating poor nutrition and food insecurity outcomes and food safety issues. And so it really becomes a real stepping ground for nutritionists and food safety scientists to work together in order to combat public health issues across the globe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jessie. Some amazing points. Just a quick reminder to place your questions in the Q&A. We are We'll spend the next half hour addressing questions from the audience, and we're happy to do so. Just to summarize a few points Jesse made. First of all, we appreciate the interface of food safety and nutrition. And what it comes down to, if it's not safe, it's not food, which means we can't access that nutrition. And so really food safety has to be a big part of the long-term discussion around food security goals. So I really appreciate you highlighting that, and also why the traditional food markets, I think it's estimated that 90% of people around the world get their foods from traditional markets. And so this is a large opportunity to really think about innovative ways to improve food safety in those spaces. So again, please send your messages or your questions to the Q&A, and otherwise I think we're ready to go. I know I certainly have a bank of questions. We've had a number come in from the audience, and we're excited to get started. Faith, if I could actually start off with you. We had a question come in. What are the innovations in pre and post-harvest water treatment, and which of these could have the most impact for developing economies? So we're talking about small scale or small shareholder farmers. What are some of the opportunities that you see in water?
Yeah, I think the largest hurdles that, in working with growers around the globe that they're facing is trying to take ultimately surface water or water which is captured and has a higher risk of microbial contamination that comes along with it, and how they go about treating it so that they can use it for post-harvest uses. And so really looking at, based upon their infrastructure and size and scale, what really meets their needs best. So I think that there are a lot of great innovations in looking at, again, not necessarily new technologies, but different applications. So UV light has definitely been one that we've been looking for, just trying to do an initial treatment and then a secondary treatment with something along the lines of the chemistry that will give us some extended activity so we can really make sure in case something happens beyond the fruit, it doesn't get into the water and then cross-contaminate. But really looking at, again, not just maybe necessarily your normal chemistries, but even looking at things like zero-valent iron and some other kind of new and up-and-coming things for their application, especially for these small to medium-scale situations where our water flow maybe isn't as great as it is in some of our larger production. And it really is mashing quite nicely there.
No, thanks for that summary, Faith. And if anyone else on the panel has anything additional they'd like to add from perspectives on water, please jump in. See if anybody comes off mute. If not, we can certainly circle back to it, because water is so foundational in everything, and it's a big part of how we prevent foodborne illness from the very growing stage to that final product that a consumer might eat. Matt, and really Jesse too, I think really anyone on this panel is very qualified to answer this question that came in. What are areas of innovation in food testing? We highlighted the importance of it so we can identify pathogens or it could be aflatoxins, so we make sure those foods don't find their way to a consumer. But what's going on in testing, and what are some of the limitations in developing economies, and what innovations need to be made to make testing feasible? Matt, if you would like to comment on that, that would be great.
Sure, I can start there, and other folks can weigh in as well. But I think, maybe the biggest innovation that I'm seeing is this idea that testing isn't the be all end all, but it's a component of the larger system. And so even for something like aflatoxins, or maybe its impact in the international grain trade is more well developed, it's still not sufficient to say your food is safe just because you got a test below 20 or 10 or 4 parts per billion, right? There's a lot that goes into that chain. And so I think continuing to put the focus on, if you absolutely need a test to meet a trade requirement, that's fine, right? Obviously do that, do your best to get the test that passes, but continue to focus on building a stronger overall food safety system that will really continue to drive risk down, which is what we heard about in all of the presentations, right? So I think that's the big piece. I mean, the other piece to talk about innovations is people are working on ways to take samples more appropriately and then also do the laboratory assays cheaper, quicker, better. Things like paper-based assays for a lot of chemistries are working really well. and just continuing to do some innovations in the analytics so that you could have a testing lab, in a non-capital or not a major city, so that you could start to get, border trades and things like that are being developed.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Jesse, I'd like to ask your thoughts too on, you've worked all over the world and primarily focused on foodborne pathogens. So what are the limitations that you see across the globe when it comes to increasing testing capacity?
Yeah, the biggest one is procuring supplies, right? And having testing supplies. And so, even if we wanted to do, and there are some wonderful, rapid tests that exist, really easy in-field, testing kits that will give you at least an answer to direct your decision making. The challenge is, how do you get them to Ethiopia? How do you get them to Cambodia? And some countries are easier to procure some of those types of testing supplies in. Other countries, much more challenging. It depends upon what companies have agreements with what nations, what are the tax restrictions, what's the hierarchy in terms of the airport and who's in charge at the airport that day. And so that's a very significant challenge. I think another area that it applies very strongly to what we're doing, but I think it applies to the US as well, and all over the globe, is trying to be more strategic with our testing and identifying what is the right sample that actually gives us the best information in terms of making a decision. So I can take samples all over markets. I can take samples all over, a beef facility and get different answers depending upon where I'm sampling. And so what sample is actually going to be the most informative in terms of that final product and what that will mean to a consumer and that public health discussion. So those would be the points I would make.
Well, I can certainly empathize with that. I don't know, here in my domestic research program, we have a shortage of tips, which can really slow down our operation. And so again, you're right, there's that supply chain of even the resources that we need to do day-to-day business. So it's a global challenge right now. Faith, there's a kind of a related question that has come in regarding water, and it's really, how do we mitigate and minimize agri-water quality in open sources or even underground water that might be contaminated with things such as heavy metals that could be due to industrialization? I know in our work in Peru, we certainly see this from mining. Do you have any thoughts on how to mitigate some of those challenges?
Yeah, I think it's, first recognizing that the contaminants there, initially, and really trying to think holistically, can we go about mitigating looking at the water, definitely, but also looking a bit more holistically, because definitely these contaminants can get into the soil and then be carried into the crop. So we want to be making informed decisions so that we're not wasting resources in crop that may ultimately not make its way to market at the end of the day. I would say that, there are definitely technologies out there that can be used to trap some of these compounds, but even, the United States, I know I'm in Washington State, we still have land laying fallow where they use mercury and also lead-based contaminants. And essentially they're in and of their nature just really tough to remove once they're in that environment, but they are slightly easier to get in a water-based system. You just have to be cognizant of that when you're using that, but definitely a lot of risk there when we're thinking through, okay, if we have to use this land, also, can we maybe go and flip the scenario instead of doing our traditional production-based systems, really looking at, some hydroponics or aquaponic-based systems that could potentially be, just another, basically taking that factor out and minimizing it. But hopefully, I'm again more of a microbiologist than a chemist, but definitely know that there are some solutions out there to help on the filtration side to help capture some of those compounds.
certainly, and as you mentioned, it becomes a question of cost, right? If we can't mitigate it, what are all, or the cost of mitigation far exceeds what could even be returned from production. How do we rethink that water, or how do we rethink that piece of land, as you mentioned, in the part of the world you're in, part of the world I'm familiar with, certainly where I grew up, it's a similar type of challenge. Dharmendra, over to you, kind of pivoting a little bit back to more the processing side. So we've talked, for the last few minutes, we've been focusing on kind of pre-harvest or testing. Perhaps you could talk to us a little bit more about the current state of aseptic processing. You talked about a number of processes and packages, but what might be suitable, or what's on the horizon for small scale production? And are there examples of some small footprint or mobile systems that are successfully aseptically processing?
A great question, Dr. Oliver. Thank you. And I think when we talk about aseptic processing, there are two kinds in there. One is the retail size, smaller packages, which tends to be very cumbersome with large fillers. Another kind is bulk packages. And I think that's where it could be really helpful to have small scale mobile platforms, perhaps, that could be not as centrally located, but could be taken into a region where we have lots of production. It could be placed there for the season and process products in larger bags, either for supplying to restaurants or food preparations, or as an end product to consumers or to home. So a small bag such as a 5-liter bag could be used for saving certain food products or food purees, or larger bags that could be used for further manufacturing of the product. So I think the small scale mobile units will be really helpful in that. There is currently, there is one example in African country where there is an installation to save the sweet potato purees in larger bags. That's an ongoing project, and I'm hoping that we will have something great coming out of that as a model.
So continuing to prevent, or to work on food security through prevention of loss, which is a big undertaking, certainly. And I know, and I think Jesse could speak to it too. We've seen examples of aseptic processing all over the world. It's finding its way to developing economies. Maybe one question, it still is a challenge of that vertical integration or getting supplies for packaging, which of course is always going to be a long-term hurdle for everyone, especially as we watch our economy right now flex its muscles and do all kinds of interesting things on inflation, according to the news this morning. So, Jesse, a really, I think, important question, and really anyone can jump in afterwards. This is a big part of what we're talking about here today on innovations. They're evolving all the time. We're coming up with new solutions, but how can stakeholders, how do the growers, how does the private sector overcome this communication gap between the inventors, or maybe we'll call it even academia? How do we get that to the field? What are the barriers, and what can we be doing, or how can growers access this information?
Yeah, and I think that sometimes I may be walking the line of becoming a social scientist, which is that I take every opportunity I can anymore to really talk about relationship building and the value of that. And one of the points I made in my talk was the need for networks, food safety networks around the world. And the reason for that is exactly this point, because there's all this messaging that exists out there as it pertains to food safety. Some of it's accurate, most of it's not. And so when we think about trying to communicate accurate information about food safety, about the innovations in food safety, I think that we have to try to establish networks that can actually carry a united, agreed upon message. And that, to me, is the current challenge, is that all across the world, there's this conflicting message as to what is food safety, what constitutes food safety, what innovations are appropriate, what innovations are not appropriate. what testing programs are appropriate, what standards are appropriate, right? And so kind of creating a network that is driven by science, that communicates that information, I think is very important. And I don't know if that answers your question more than just says, yes, that's a problem and we need to overcome it.
It's a challenge, and I'm sure Faith has some comments as well, because she does extension and outreach as a major part of her job, and she runs into this hurdle all the time. So how do you deal with it? How do you overcome, Faith?
Yeah, I think that Jessie is right. We really have to look at building relationships. And part of our biggest hurdle whenever we're trying to investigate a situation, right? We were working with some berry growers in South America who import a lot, and so to the United States and to other countries all around the world. And they were really looking at, water treatment. And it took getting to know them and getting to know what was the right fit, right? Because there's a lot of keys, but one's going to work better than the other when we start thinking about these solutions. And taking the time to actually get to know them is key. And what's going to mean success for them, right? Because we can't just take what worked in this scenario and then supplant it over. So really building those relationships and knowing that everybody has the same end game. Regardless of size or scale, I've never met someone growing produce who wants to kill their customers, right? So I think that it's a poor business plan. So I think that, everybody has that in mind. It's just making them profitable in addition to, achieving that food safety goal that we have.
No, absolutely. No, we must keep the customer base, even if it's just our family. We must keep the customer base alive and well through safe and nutritious food. Dharmendra, a question for you, kind of in this same vein. How do you get people to make the technology investment? And the other side of that question is, how do you champion food safety over quality? How do you convey that message globally? As Jessie mentioned, that's one of our biggest hurdles.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's where it all starts, with the design of the technology. So when we look at the technologies implementations, I think there are instances where we design not keeping food safety in mind, but that's the mindset that we need to change, where we start from the design, keeping in mind the food safety aspects, and wherever we interact with manufacturers, the technological development aspects, we say, let's take a look at the design before we can install and start using the equipment. So that's one of the aspects, and I think that's really important to note that even for a large scale production or a small scale production, the risk is still similar. So how do we mitigate from proper design phases and proper use and operation? So those are the key aspects.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And Matt, from your angle, what are your thoughts on this point?
Well, so yeah, I heard a lot of things swimming around, and one way that I thought I could potentially jump in, we've talked a lot about supply chain and networks, and I think there's maybe an opportunity here to start to rethink in innovations this approach in maybe the richer world of our approach to disposable everything. For example, with testing, classic microbiology doesn't throw everything away, right? We have Petri dishes, we find ways to sterilize. You could do that in many cases in a much lower resource setting with good training. And a lot of universities, are already training that way, maybe because they have to, but that's a resource, right? To teach people to do assays cheaper. I mean, potato dextrose agar is potatoes and sugar, right? You can make that. So I think there's a big opportunity there, and probably the same way with packaging and other kinds of designs as well. So.
No, I think it's important to bring into the discussion the sustainability piece of everything we're talking about and the cost versus benefit of it all.
Well, and Haley, I really think that Matt just made a really fantastic point. And that when we think about particularly microbiology, and I hear this all the time whenever we're doing projects, it's like, oh, can we just get that in glass? and so, I mean, I think it's a great point that we do get very used to, here in the US, kind of conducting a study in a certain way and just shifting back to some traditional ways. They're still effective. They still get us to that answer. And they are, to your point, sometimes much more sustainable in some of the settings where we're working.
There's an interesting paper in PLOS even showing that you can use these modern electric pressure cookers and they're validated autoclaves. They validated them, right? So, I could share that with the panel later, but it's useful.
No, absolutely. I think as common, pressure cooking is very common around the world. And I've had some of the most amazing food from pressure cookers around the world, including in Afghanistan. And it inspired me to, go back to that model. And then a very common product here in the United States is the Instant Pot, which is effectively a pressure cooker, which is effectively an autoclave. So we're making food extremely safe if you want to cook your food, all of it that way. So that's fun that there's actually a paper out kind of highlighting that.
But if you want to use Instapot pressure cooker for preserving food, be careful with that.
Yeah, we're not championing it. It's not a completely validated method, but if you have questions, Dharmendra is your guy. He's our engineer that can talk to you all day about pressure and temperature and what it would take to make that food truly safe in a preserved setting. I think there's another question that came in, and it's very much in this vein. And Jesse, maybe you can lead it off. There's a lot of waste leaving food markets, and particularly traditional markets. What can we be doing with that? And Dharmendra, certainly jump in here. Are there good innovations currently, or what are people thinking about when it comes to the waste aspect of these foods?
Yeah, so cold chain, I think particularly in like spaces like South and Southeast Asia is a huge issue in terms of post-harvest loss, right? And I think cold chain connected to how, particularly vegetables, I think vegetables are probably one of the biggest losses that we see. A lot of times, meat tends to be kind of live and then, fresh slaughter. Packing of those vegetables, you end up with a basket this tall with tomatoes in it. And then by the end of the day, there's like a surprise that there's salsa in the bottom. And so, I think just some basic shifts towards rethinking how we package vegetables or present vegetables within markets. Cold chain's a huge one. Another one that kind of crosses food safety, food quality that we see a lot in Cambodia is vendors will trim bruised portions of vegetables, right? And so trying to make the vegetable look better or communicate to the consumer that they're, trying to improve the quality of the vegetable. And then, because that knowledge doesn't exist, really breaking down the safety of that vegetable and then increasing the likelihood that vegetable is going to perish by the end of the day. And so I think those are some things that could definitely increase our effectiveness in reducing loss on a market level. The other one, and this one's kind of a tough one because it does require a lot of country level investment, is just improvements to market infrastructure, right? Just having the appropriate types of infrastructure within markets so that you can actually handle those products in an effective way.
And if I can jump in there as well, those are really great points, Jesse. I think when we look at the produce specifically and cold chains, and that's where this idea of value addition and preserving the foods is important. We can use whatever we can in the fresh mode, but the remaining, usually I have seen that it goes to waste because of two reasons. One is not proper storage, and second, there is overproduction, and then there are no buyers for it. So I think in both of those situations, we can add value to the product and preserve it for a long-term use where we can keep it in shelf-stable conditions. And those are the technologies that I mentioned that could be potentially used. And I think there is a great value there to reduce the the food loss and food waste that we currently have.
Sorry, and just one more thing, and to connect back to a lot of what Faith has talked about, safe water within markets, right? Trying to ensure that we can actually provide access to safe water, and that is a huge issue.
I think even, and then tying to Matt's work, we're trying to improve testing, how we can identify foods that are unsafe at the front end. But we have to recognize that if a food is deemed unsafe, it then moves over into that food loss category. It might be an instance where it could be processed to a safer state, but it may not. If it's a leafy green, if it's a fresh vegetable that does not have intent, or at least from an organoleptic standpoint, have a cook step that would be interesting, that does fall into loss. And so back to every person's point here, prevention is truly key. And a question just came in actually that, what are some, there's some part of spoilage that a large amount of spoilage that happens at the farm level. I think on average around the world, it's somewhere in the 30 to 40% range of total loss happens at the primary production. What are some of the strategies to manage that? I think Jesse mentioned cold chain, but that's a little tough sell sometimes right at the farm. So what are other things that people can be doing to try to minimize that spoilage? Open to the full panel always.
I'll jump in first, Haley. I think a lot of times just knowing how to get the longest shelf life from something that's highly perishable like a fruit or vegetable is going to be key, because at the end of the day, if we know what's optimal, then we know how far we're driving it to one end or the other, right? So that we know, okay, we're really making the spoil far faster than maybe if we held things this way. So a really great example is just temperature control, and not necessarily refrigeration, but trying to keep things back in the shade can go a long way in getting an extra day, and an extra day gets you more of that product sold. So sometimes it's not, a lot of money that we're putting into this stuff. It's really like, oh, can we rethink the way that we've set up, our booth, or even something along those lines. And to me, even though you grow crops, they are still living, right? Once we harvest them. So really trying to keep them, at their optimal freshness so that they can make it longer and ultimately make their way into the marketplace.
And then I can add one more thing there. If at the farm level, when we are thinking, that's where some of the technological advancements could help, not from a machine perspective, but even when we think of preserving the food. So let's say we are at the point where it can no longer be saved food to be sold in its current form. So what else can we do to preserve that product? Either we could do a pickling, hot filling, some other methods that could in a very small scale can be done efficiently. I think that's where there should be a more training perhaps is needed for wide-scale adoptions.
Well, and I think I would add too that some of, we typically get into a food safety mindset that's very, we're controlling for pathogens. But some of our practices that are seeking to improve farm level food safety also reduce the number of spoilage microorganisms that can end up on, your vegetables. And so something as simple as saying, trying to encourage, high quality soil amendments, good quality water, right? Those types of on-farm safety practices that we kind of tend to think of our pathogen reduction controls also, can really reduce what's going to ultimately be there to spoil those vegetables.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that point, we've talked a lot about produce here, but a really clear example of that is in cereals and grains. The same kinds of good agricultural practices, clean drying and hermetic storage that reduces aflatoxin, reduces grains and other fungal, diseases. And so that's useful, right? That you're driving quality and safety and yield all together. And so that's useful. And so then we can think, where are some of those simple wins in produce as well. I mean, one thing we haven't talked maybe quite as much about, but I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity in small scale drying when it's done well. I mean, that's another way to extend shelf life and reduce spoilage, and could even have some opportunities to provide cleaner water and better handling practices, so you don't have issues with trimming and other issues like that, because you can control your process if you're thinking about it as a value-added process. I think that's a good opportunity.
No, certainly, and it launches completely across the food systems over into animal and animal-based products. Right, the fewer organisms we have landing on our meat or in our milk, the longer the shelf life. And certainly, if we have it with safety in mind, we get the added value of quality too. So there is definitely an intimate relationship between the two. Food safety, the safety part has to win, because as Faith so elegantly put it, we can't kill our customers. We need people to be safe. We need them to be healthy. But safety kind of runs that show. And you'll hear from the conversation today. We've talked a lot about microorganisms, and I appreciate Matt bringing in aflatoxins. You do have a panel of microbiologists and engineers here today. And so we often think, at least I certainly do, more biased towards the microbiology side, but it is also the focus of the Food Safety Innovation Lab that we're focusing on microbial pathogens. And the reason for that is that there's been a historically large investment working on chemical hazards like pesticides, insecticides, and aflatoxins and mycotoxins falling into that category of chemical hazards. And there's been less investment and less intentional thought around microbiological, so Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli controls, norovirus controls around the world. And yet it's estimated, at least from in Africa, that 90% of foodborne illnesses are microbially driven. So why we're talking about it at great length here, why the Food Safety Innovation Lab focuses on those, is because of the impact that they're having around the world. As we're drawing to a close, I have two final questions. The final one for everyone, and we'll come back to it, is what is your favorite pathogen and why? And why is it important? Is something everyone has to definitely answer. But if I might, if everyone could maybe comment on your favorite example or a technology that you think was particularly successful in improving food safety in a developing economy setting, and the impact that innovation might have had. I'll turn it over. I know that's a big question, so whoever has a thought, feel free to jump in.
I'll hop in. Go ahead.
Please go ahead, Jesse.
Oh, okay. I'm going to give a shout out to the dry card, which was an innovation that was tested and scaled by the Horticulture Innovation Lab at UC Davis. And so it's a really handy little card that you can throw in any type of a sealed product. So back to Matt's point on making sure that, rices and grains, those types of products are dry. You throw it in there and it'll tell you if it's dry or if it's got too high of a humidity. And I think that that's a nice, simple innovation that has really shown to have a lot of usability in many countries around the world.
Cost effective.
Thank you. So I can go ahead next, and I think there are two very simple and very effective examples I can provide. That is through Purdue. One is the PICS bags. I think they have made a great impact in developing economies, because you can store the grains really well in those bags, because it provides any kind of any protection against the infestations of insects. Second is a solar drying. It's a really nice small box for solar drying, and you can dry any kinds of fruits and vegetables in there very effectively. So I think those two are really great examples. Simple designs, very effective.
I'll talk about maybe more of a systems example. A while ago, I worked with a company in Zambia that was trying to do value-added addition for sustainable goals and the rest. And basically, they ended up getting an old tobacco dryer and used it to dry the surplus of mangoes that would show up, in very short periods of time. And so, the technology isn't particularly new, but that's what was available. They could figure out ways to power it with biofuels that weren't overly forest depleting. And that allowed them to then sell these dried mangoes into urban centers and add some value to that crop. So I thought that was useful.
Yeah, and my example would probably be more along the people and organization standpoint, because I think when we've had conversations with groups that were trying to develop markets, there is a sort of security in number, right? Especially for some of these infrastructure intense, processes and things along those lines. So in my world, in produce, if we're all growing similar things that basically receive the same post-harvest handling, then we can basically aggregate and then go and process all in one area. And that has been, game changing as far as, basically having enough volume of product to sell so that you really can get it out in the marketplace and have better options as far as who you're selling to goes. I know that's not a specific technology, but I think it goes a long way. But it does take, as we've already mentioned, really getting in there and working together as a group, right? And getting everybody on the same page as far as aligning what you're going to do and how you're going to carry it out.
No, Faith, I think you hit a big piece of this, and something we run into in domestic research and research for development. It's awareness and bringing people to the table of what the hazard is, what the challenge is, and what can we do to cost effectively solve it. And there is power in numbers that way. And it's a big part. And it's why I think bacteria have been last to the discussion when it comes to food safety. They're hard to see. So it's a harder time to convince it. All right. In 15 seconds, Faith, what is your favorite foodborne pathogen, or why is it a challenge, and why should the world care about it?
Yeah. Salmonella has to be, a top hitter for me. It is so resilient. I mean, something that can survive in, concrete and then be broken free and contaminate product, I think is a formidable foe. And it is very resilient in the environment. So, and affects a lot of produce. So that's mine.
Jesse, what's your favorite?
Salmonella. It is the foe, because I think that it has the capacity to just surprise the heck out of you. And I actually appreciate that about it. I'm like, no, good on you, Salmonella. Good on you. You didn't read the book about yourself, did you?
I respect it. I've had salmonellosis. I respect it. Matt, what's your favorite?
So maybe given my training, I know the numbers don't support listeria as much in the developing world, but I still, think about the emerging cold chain and the challenges we'll have and continue to have as we improve environmental monitoring and control for it. I think, South Africa potentially gave an example of that. And so I'll keep thinking about that as well.
As will I. Dharmendra, over to you.
Mine is Clostridium botulinum. So whenever we talk about shelf-stable food product, that's the organism that we worry about the most. So process it safely, everyone.
That's right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm glad they all got some unique votes and different reasons why, but food safety remains a challenge around the world. Again, 600 million cases, and I anticipate that's a conservative estimate. When we think about how many people are affected by foodborne disease, the types of organisms that cause disease are going to shift as the climate shifts, as our expectations around nutrition shift. So we'll all be researching for quite a while. Everyone here is quite early career, and we'll be continuing to work on solving those challenges. So thank you, everyone on the panel. We really appreciate your time. And thanks to the audience for the questions that came in. If I could briefly introduce, I believe we have another session that's actually queued for this particular series. So it will be happening on July 20th, so just one short week away, same time, same place, looking at food and production processings for markets. So the moderator, Dr. Beth Mitchum from the University of California, Davis, will be leading that discussion. I'm sure it will be a great and exciting time. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of the week. Take care.